What's the problem, officer?
You're under arrest for trespassing.
Trespassing? In my own courthouse? Sir, stop resisting and comply with my instructions.
I'm Judge David Vance. You're arresting a federal judge.
Sure you are, and I'm the Chief Justice.
Your supervisor's going to hear about this, and your career is over.
Kevin Finch's law enforcement career lasted exactly 127 days, from his first day patrolling Cincinnati's Courthouse district to his final termination hearing. Every decision led him toward one catastrophic Thursday evening that would make national headlines. He'd been warned during training about making assumptions, about verifying before acting, about understanding the difference between criminal activity and normal behavior. But when Finch saw a black man in a courthouse after hours, all his training disappeared, replaced by biases that would cost him everything and teach a city the true price of prejudice in uniform. Before we dive deeper into this unbelievable story, let me ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, now's the perfect time. We're about to uncover a story of power, prejudice, and consequences that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about authority and justice. Your support helps us bring these crucial stories to light. Hamilton County Courthouse stands as a monument to justice in downtown Cincinnati. Built in 1919, its neoclassical architecture commands respect with towering marble columns, brass fixtures that gleam under fluorescent lighting, and hallways that echo with the footsteps of those seeking justice. The building houses 12 courtrooms, dozens of chambers, and administrative offices where the business of federal law unfolds daily. By 7 p.m. on most weeknights, the building empties except for security staff, cleaning crews, and the occasional judge or attorney working late on complex cases. Kevin Finch had been assigned to the courthouse patrol route 3 weeks earlier. At 24 years old, he represented everything wrong with fast-track police training programs. He'd graduated from the Cincinnati Police Academy with a 78% average, barely above the minimum passing requirement. His instructors noted in his file that he was eager but impulsive and tends to make rapid judgments without gathering sufficient information. During his field training, 2 different senior officers had flagged him for what they called assumption-based policing, seeing criminal activity where none existed based on stereotypes rather than evidence. But Cincinnati PD was desperate for officers. Budget cuts had reduced the force by 15% over 2 years, and they couldn't afford to wash out recruits who met the basic technical requirements. So Kevin Finch, with his documented tendency to jump to conclusions and his barely passing academy performance, was cleared for solo patrol after the minimum required supervision period. His training officer, Sergeant Nadia Ruiz, had recommended an extended probationary period, but staffing needs overruled caution. The decision to put Finch on courthouse duty seemed logical to his supervisors. Federal buildings required police presence, but the environment was controlled and predictable. What could go wrong in a courthouse after hours? It wasn't like he was patrolling high-crime neighborhoods or responding to domestic violence calls. The courthouse was supposed to be the safe assignment where a rookie could learn the rhythms of professional policing without major consequences for poor judgment. That Thursday evening started normally for Finch. He'd completed 2 uneventful circuits of the building's exterior, checked in with courthouse security, and verified that all public entrances were properly secured. The building's interior was quiet except for the usual sounds of HVAC systems and distant voices of cleaning staff. Everything appeared routine until 8:47 p.m., when Finch noticed light coming from beneath the door of one of the judicial chambers on the 4th floor. Finch approached the door and listened. He could hear movement inside, papers rustling, and what sounded like someone opening and closing desk drawers. His training kicked in, but not the good parts. Instead of knocking and announcing himself, instead of checking with courthouse security about who might be authorized to work late, instead of following proper procedure for investigating potential unauthorized presence, Finch let his assumptions take control. In his mind, the scenario was clear. Someone was in a judge's chambers after hours, going through sensitive documents. It had to be theft, corporate espionage, or document tampering. The fact that the lights were on and the person wasn't trying to hide their presence didn't register as evidence of legitimate activity. The fact that courthouse security had made no reports of break-ins or suspicious activity didn't factor into his assessment. Kevin Finch saw an opportunity to make a significant arrest, to prove his worth as a police officer, to show his supervisors that their decision to put him on solo patrol was correct. He tried the chamber door and found it unlocked. Rather than following any of the de-escalation protocols he'd been taught, Finch burst through the door with his hand on his service weapon, ready to confront what he was certain would be a criminal in the act. What he found instead was a man in an expensive suit sitting behind an ornate wooden desk, reading legal documents under a brass lamp, with law books open around him and case files organized in neat stacks. The nameplate on the desk read, "The Honorable David Vance, United States District Judge." The legitimate work materials, or the calm demeanor of someone doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. All Kevin Finch saw was a black man in a judge's chambers after hours, and his biased mind immediately classified that as criminal activity requiring immediate intervention. Judge David Vance had been working late in his chambers for 8 years, and no one had ever questioned his right to be there. At 47 years old, he was one of the most respected federal judges in the Southern District of Ohio, appointed to the bench after a distinguished career that had taken him from public defender to federal prosecutor, to the judicial appointment that represented the pinnacle of legal achievement. His colleagues knew him as meticulous, fair, and utterly dedicated to the principles of justice that had guided his entire professional life. The path to his judicial appointment had been neither quick nor easy. Vance had grown up in Cincinnati's West End, the son of a postal worker and a school teacher who had instilled in him the values of hard work, education, and service to community. He'd earned a full scholarship to Ohio State University, where he graduated summa cum laude with a degree in political science before attending Harvard Law School. At Harvard, he'd served on the law review and graduated in the top 10% of his class. Achievements that opened doors but didn't guarantee success in a legal profession that still struggled with diversity at its highest levels. After graduation, Vance had made a choice that surprised many of his classmates who were heading to prestigious corporate law firms. He returned to Cincinnati to work as a public defender, representing clients who couldn't afford private attorneys in cases that ranged from minor drug offenses to serious felonies. For 5 years, he'd learned the criminal justice system from the ground up, developing the courtroom skills and deep understanding of constitutional law that would define his career. His colleagues remembered him as an attorney who never lost sight of his client's humanity, even when defending those accused of terrible crimes. The transition to federal prosecutor came when the U.S. Attorney's Office recruited him for his trial experience and his reputation for thorough preparation. As an assistant U.S. attorney, Vance had handled complex cases involving organized crime, public corruption, and federal drug trafficking. His conviction rate was among the highest in the office. But more importantly, his cases stood up on appeal because of his meticulous attention to constitutional procedure and evidence gathering. Defense attorneys respected him because he was tough but fair. Judges appreciated his thorough legal briefs and his courtroom professionalism. Vance's judicial nomination came after 12 years as a federal prosecutor. The process had been rigorous, involving extensive background checks by the FBI, review by the American Bar Association, and confirmation hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Every aspect of his legal career, his personal life, and his judicial philosophy had been scrutinized by senators, legal experts, and advocacy groups. He'd been unanimously confirmed, a rare achievement in an era of partisan politics and contentious judicial nominations. On the federal bench, Judge Vance had presided over more than 2,000 cases ranging from routine civil disputes to high-profile criminal trials. He'd sentenced white-collar criminals who'd stolen millions from pension funds. He'd overseen complex civil rights cases involving police misconduct and discrimination. He'd handled death penalty appeals that required him to balance his personal opposition to capital punishment with his judicial obligation to follow federal law. His judicial opinions were frequently cited by other courts and legal scholars for their clarity, thoroughness, and careful reasoning. The legal community knew Judge Vance as someone who ran his courtroom with dignity and respect for all participants, regardless of their background or the nature of their case. Attorneys who appeared before him appreciated his preparation, his fairness, and his ability to cut through complex legal arguments to focus on the essential issues. Court staff valued his treating everyone from bailiffs to law clerks with the same courtesy he showed to prominent attorneys and fellow judges. That Thursday evening, Vance had been in his chambers since 6:30 p.m., working on a complex antitrust case that required him to review hundreds of pages of economic analysis and legal precedents. The case involved allegations that a major corporation had illegally conspired to fix prices, and Vance needed to understand the intricate economic theories underlying both the government's claims and the defense arguments. This type of intensive legal research was impossible to complete during normal court hours when he was hearing cases, meeting with attorneys, and handling the administrative duties that came with his position. His chambers reflected the seriousness of his work and his respect for the law. The walls were lined with legal texts, judicial opinions, and law reviews that he consulted regularly. His desk, carved from rich mahogany and bearing the seal of the federal courts, was organized with the precision of someone who understood that small details could determine the outcome of major cases. Family photos showed him with his wife of 20 years and their twin daughters, now sophomores in college, reminders of the personal life he balanced with his judicial responsibilities. Vance had been reviewing a particularly complex economic analysis when he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his chambers. The courthouse was never completely empty, and he'd grown accustomed to the sounds of cleaning crews and security guards making their rounds. He'd looked up from his documents when he heard the footsteps stop directly outside his door, but he'd assumed it was courthouse security making their routine checks. When his chamber door suddenly burst open, and he found himself facing a young police officer with his hand on his weapon, Judge Vance experienced something he'd never felt in 8 years on the federal bench: the shocking realization that his judicial authority, his professional reputation, and his distinguished career meant nothing to someone who had already decided he didn't belong in his own chambers. The irony wasn't lost on him. Judge David Vance, who had spent his entire career ensuring that the justice system treated all people fairly, regardless of their race or background, was about to become the victim of the same racial profiling he'd seen destroy lives in his own courtroom. The confrontation escalated within seconds. Officer Kevin Finch stood in the doorway of Judge David Vance's chambers, his hand hovering near his service weapon, his rookie instincts overriding every protocol he'd been taught about de-escalation and situational assessment. Judge Vance remained seated behind his desk, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling courtroom situations. "Officer, I need you to look around this room," Judge Vance said, gesturing toward the nameplate on his desk, the judicial certificates on his walls, and the official seal of the federal courts mounted behind his chair. "This is my office. I'm Judge David Vance, and I'm working late on a federal case." Finch's response revealed the depth of his inexperience and bias. Anyone can sit in an office and claim to be someone important. Step away from the desk and keep your hands visible. From the hallway, Victor Hale, the courthouse's evening security guard, heard the raised voices and approached the chambers. Hale had worked courthouse security for 12 years and knew every judge, attorney, and staff member who regularly worked late hours. He immediately recognized Judge Vance's voice and understood what was happening. "Officer, that's Judge Vance," Hale said, appearing in the doorway. "He's here most Thursday evenings working on cases. There's no problem here." Finch ignored him completely. His tunnel vision had locked onto what he perceived as a criminal situation, and no amount of evidence would change his predetermined conclusion. "Sir, you're under arrest for trespassing in a federal building. You cannot arrest a federal judge in his own chambers," Judge Vance replied, his judicial composure beginning to crack as the absurdity of the situation became clear. But Kevin Finch was beyond reason. He'd committed to his course of action, and admitting error wasn't in his psychological makeup. When Judge Vance stood up from his desk to retrieve his judicial identification, Finch interpreted the movement as resistance. "Stop resisting and turn around," Finch commanded, pulling out his handcuffs. Attorney Leila Moreno, working late in her office down the hall, heard the commotion and rushed toward Judge Vance's chambers. What she witnessed would later become crucial testimony in the federal lawsuit that would destroy Finch's career. She saw a sitting federal judge being handcuffed in his own chambers by a rookie officer who refused to listen to courthouse security, refused to examine obvious evidence of legitimate presence, and refused to acknowledge the massive mistake he was making. The arrest of Judge David Vance was complete. The Hamilton County Courthouse had witnessed many dramatic moments in its century-long history, but nothing compared to the chaos that erupted when Sergeant Nadia Ruiz arrived at 9:15 p.m. to find her rookie officer attempting to escort a handcuffed federal judge out of his own chambers. Ruiz had been Kevin Finch's field training officer, and she'd received the radio call with growing dread as the dispatcher described the situation developing in the courthouse. Ruiz took one look at the scene and immediately understood the magnitude of the disaster. Judge David Vance stood in handcuffs outside his chambers, his judicial dignity intact despite the metal restraints around his wrists. Victor Hale, the security guard, was frantically explaining to anyone who would listen that this was a sitting federal judge. Attorney Lila Moreno stood nearby, her phone already recording the unprecedented scene of a federal judge under arrest in his own workplace. "Finch, what the hell have you done?" Ruiz demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen rookie mistakes before, but never one with these potential consequences. "Sergeant, I apprehended a trespasser in Judge Vance's chambers," Finch replied, still convinced he'd made a legitimate arrest. This individual was going through legal documents after hours without authorization. Ruiz looked at the nameplate on the chamber door, at the judicial certificates visible through the open doorway, at Victor Hale nodding vigorously, and at Judge Vance himself, whose calm demeanor and professional bearing screamed legitimate authority. She'd been a police supervisor for 8 years, and she'd never encountered such obvious evidence of officer error. "Officer Finch," Judge Vance said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority even while handcuffed. "I strongly suggest you remove these restraints immediately and call your watch commander. What you've done here tonight will have consequences that extend far beyond your understanding." Ruiz immediately unlocked the handcuffs, her hands shaking slightly as she realized she was freeing a federal judge who had been illegally detained by one of her officers. "Your Honor, I sincerely apologize for this incident. Officer Finch is suspended pending immediate investigation." Judge Vance rubbed his wrists where the handcuffs had left red marks, his judicial composure masking the anger and humiliation he felt at being criminalized in his own workplace. "Sergeant, this isn't about an apology. This is about an officer who saw a black man in a position of authority and immediately assumed criminality. This is about training failures, supervision failures, and institutional bias that allowed this situation to occur." Within an hour, the courthouse was swarming with activity. The district commander arrived to personally apologize to Judge Vance. The U.S. Marshals Service, responsible for courthouse security, launched an immediate investigation. The chief judge of the Southern District of Ohio was contacted at home and arrived to assess the situation personally. But the real explosion came when the story hit social media. Attorney Lila Moreno's video, showing a federal judge in handcuffs outside his own chambers, went viral within hours. The hashtag number "Judge Arrested" began trending nationally as legal professionals, civil rights advocates, and ordinary citizens expressed their outrage at the unprecedented scene. The Cincinnati Police Department found itself facing a public relations nightmare of epic proportions. How do you explain arresting a federal judge in his own courthouse? How do you justify an officer who ignored a security guard's identification, visible evidence of legitimate presence, and the testimony of multiple witnesses? By midnight, every major news outlet was covering the story. Legal experts called it the most egregious case of racial profiling in recent memory. Federal judges across the country issued statements expressing solidarity with Judge Vance and concern about the implications for judicial independence. Kevin Finch spent the night writing incident reports that would be scrutinized by internal affairs investigators, federal marshals, and ultimately civil rights attorneys. He still didn't fully understand what he'd done wrong, but the faces of his supervisors and the urgency of their response suggested his law enforcement career was effectively over. Judge David Vance returned to his chambers, but he didn't return to his case research. Instead, he sat behind his desk and contemplated the irony that someone who had spent 8 years protecting civil rights from the bench had just become a victim of the same systemic bias he'd worked to combat. Kevin Finch's law enforcement career officially ended 127 days after it began, but the consequences of his catastrophic judgment would ripple through the Cincinnati Police Department for years to come. The termination hearing lasted less than 20 minutes. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were unimpeachable, and the video footage was undeniable. A rookie officer had arrested a sitting federal judge in his own chambers, ignored multiple attempts to prevent the mistake, and created a civil rights violation so egregious that it defied rational explanation. The termination letter was brutal in its clarity. Officer Kevin Finch demonstrated a complete failure of judgment, ignored obvious evidence of legitimate presence, disregarded witness testimony, and engaged in racial profiling that resulted in the unlawful detention of a federal judge. His actions brought dishonor to the Cincinnati Police Department and violated the civil rights of a distinguished member of the federal judiciary. Employment terminated immediately with no possibility of reinstatement. Finch's name was entered into the National Decertification Index, ensuring he would never work in law enforcement again in any capacity. At 24 years old, the career he dreamed of since childhood was destroyed by a single evening of bias-driven poor judgment. His attempts to appeal the termination were rejected at every level. No union representative could defend arresting a federal judge in his own courthouse. No legal argument could justify ignoring a security guard's identification and visible evidence of legitimate authority. Judge David Vance's federal lawsuit sought $2.7 million in damages for civil rights violations, emotional distress, and the unprecedented humiliation of being arrested while performing his judicial duties. The complaint, filed in his own district court but assigned to another judge to avoid conflicts of interest, detailed not just Finch's actions but the systemic training failures that had allowed an obviously unprepared officer to patrol alone after minimal supervision. The city's legal department took one look at the evidence and recommended immediate settlement. The courthouse security footage showed everything. Judge Vance, sitting peacefully at his desk. Finch bursting through the door with his hand on his weapon. The obvious judicial nameplate and certificates that Finch ignored. Victor Hale attempting to intervene. Attorney Lila Moreno witnessing the arrest. The handcuffs being applied to a sitting federal judge in his own chambers. Cincinnati settled within 18 months, paying Judge Vance $2.7 million in what became one of the largest civil rights settlements in Ohio history. But the financial cost was minimal compared to the institutional reforms the settlement required. The Cincinnati Police Department was forced to implement comprehensive bias training, extend field training periods, and create new protocols for investigating suspected criminal activity in government buildings. Judge Vance used the settlement to establish a civil rights foundation focused on police training and accountability. His testimony before the city council was powerful and measured. I've spent 8 years on the federal bench protecting civil rights, ensuring due process, and upholding the Constitution. Officer Finch saw me in my own chambers and decided I was a criminal based on nothing more than my presence in a position of authority he couldn't accept. If this can happen to a federal judge in his own courthouse, imagine what happens to ordinary citizens who don't have judicial power to protect them. The legal community's response was swift and comprehensive. Bar associations across the country used the case as an example of systemic bias in law enforcement. Law schools incorporated the incident into civil rights curricula. Federal judges began speaking publicly about the need for police accountability and bias training. Kevin Finch disappeared from public view, his law enforcement ambitions destroyed by 127 days of poor judgment, culminating in one catastrophic evening. He moved back to his hometown, took a job in retail management, and learned that some mistakes follow you forever. Judge David Vance returned to his chambers and continued his distinguished judicial career, but the red marks on his wrists from that Thursday evening served as a permanent reminder that even the highest positions of authority provide no protection from bias and assumption. The Hamilton County Courthouse still stands as a monument to justice, but now it also serves as a reminder that justice must be constantly defended, even from those sworn to protect it. And if you believe that accountability starts with awareness, and that change begins when we refuse to accept the unacceptable, then hit that subscribe button. We're going to keep exposing these patterns. We're going to keep demanding better from those in authority. We're going to keep fighting for a justice system that protects everyone, regardless of race, position, or circumstance. This isn't just about one rookie officer or one federal judge. It's about the society we're willing to accept and the standards we're willing to enforce.